How has your day been so far? Hello, we're AETA Stories, and today we're sharing a brand new original story with you.
Hannah Whitaker woke up 5 minutes before the alarm, the way she always did. Her body had learned the schedule long before her mind could protest it. For more than a year, she had been rising at the same hour every morning without fail, as if something inside her refused to let her rest any longer than necessary. She lay still for a moment, listening. From the bedroom beyond the thin wall came the slow, uneven sound of breathing. Her mother was asleep. The rhythm wasn't smooth, not anymore, but it was steady, and that was enough. After the stroke, every quiet night felt like a small mercy. Hannah waited until she was sure there were no signs of distress. Then, carefully slid off the couch she slept on, wincing as one of the springs creaked despite her efforts. The apartment was cold. The landlord had promised the heating issue would be fixed by the end of the week, which usually meant nothing at all. Hannah pulled on a sweater over her t-shirt and moved quietly to the window. Outside, the streetlights cast a pale yellow glow over the snow-packed sidewalks of Des Moines. It had snowed again overnight, the kind that didn't look heavy, but bit through your shoes and into your bones if you stood still too long. She washed her face with cold water. The hot water had been shut off the night before, and tied her hair back in a loose ponytail. In the small kitchen, she prepared a simple breakfast for her mother, oatmeal already portioned, and a cup with her morning pills set beside it. She wrote a short note and placed it next to the bowl, even though some days her mother struggled to read. After the stroke, Hannah's mother needed help with nearly everything: dressing, bathing, medication, appointments. Hannah was 26, but she lived the life of someone twice that age. Her days measured not by dreams or plans, but by schedules and prescriptions. She checked the time. If she didn't leave now, she would be late. Hannah pulled on her coat, wrapped a scarf around her neck, and slipped out into the hallway. The elevator had been broken for 2 months. For flights of stairs, every day, she took them carefully, one step at a time, already feeling the familiar ache in her knees. Outside, the cold hit her immediately. The Midwest winter didn't announce itself loudly. It simply settled in and refused to leave. Hannah walked briskly, hands tucked into her coat pockets, her breath visible in short, white bursts. The cafe was a 20-minute walk if she kept a steady pace. She always did. As she walked, her thoughts drifted, as they often did, to money. Her paycheck was late again, 2 weeks now, with only vague promises from the owner. The pharmacy bill from last week sat folded in her pocket, a reminder that her mother's medications didn't wait for excuses. Every dollar Hannah earned already belonged to something else. The morning corner cafe came into view just as the sky began to lighten. It occupied the ground floor of an aging apartment building, its windows fogged from yesterday's cooking, its sign modest and unassuming. Inside, it was nothing special: 6 tables, a counter, a small kitchen, but for the neighborhood it was familiar, reliable, necessary. Hannah unlocked the door and stepped inside, flipping on the lights one by one. The silence of the empty cafe wrapped around her. She hung up her coat, tied on her apron, and began her routine. Start the coffee machine, wipe down the tables, check the fridge, set out the chairs. She did this every morning, always first. It was an unspoken rule. No one had ever formally said it, but everyone knew it. Hannah opened the cafe at 6 o'clock sharp. She always had, rain or snow, sick or exhausted. She was the one who turned the key, who brought the place to life before the first customers arrived. There was no room for mistakes. If she was late, the owner complained. If something wasn't clean enough, it was her fault. If the register didn't balance, the blame found its way to her. By the time the clock reached 5:57, everything was ready. Hannah stood behind the counter, shoulders slightly hunched, hands resting on the worn surface, feeling the weight of the day ahead settle onto her. She was tired in a way sleep couldn't fix. But she stood there anyway, waiting for 6 o'clock because this was what she did. Because someone depended on her. Because there were bills to pay and no one else to take her place. Hannah Whitaker always opened the cafe first. And she never allowed herself to forget how easily everything could fall apart if she didn't. Frank Donovan appeared one morning at the edge of Hannah Whitaker's routine. Quietly and without ceremony, as if he had always been there and she had only just learned to notice him. He stood near the side alley behind the Morning Corner Café, close to the dumpsters where the wind cut sharply through the narrow space between buildings. He was tall, though his posture had folded inward over the years, and he wore a worn army coat that had seen better decades. His beard was gray and uneven, his gloves mismatched, but his eyes were clear, not glassy, not pleading, just watchful. Hannah saw him through the back window while wiping down the counter. He wasn't digging through the trash like others sometimes did. He wasn't shouting or pacing. He simply stood there, hands tucked into his coat, waiting for something or nothing at all. When she stepped out with a trash bag, he nodded once, politely, as if acknowledging her presence rather than asking anything of her. The second time she saw him, she brought out a small container of soup. It was still warm, left over from the day before, food that would otherwise be thrown away. The owner had been very clear about the rules. No food left the building. Everything had to be logged, discarded properly accounted for. Hannah knew that. She also knew the container fit easily into her coat pocket. She handed it to him without a word. Frank accepted it with both hands, like it was something fragile. "Thank you," he said simply. No embellishment, no story, no promise of blessings or repayment. After that, it became something quiet and unspoken between them. Hannah never brought food when someone else could see. She waited until the kitchen was busy or the owner was gone. Sometimes it was soup, sometimes bread. Once, a piece of pie that had cracked and wouldn't be sold. Frank never complained, never asked for more. He ate slowly, always finishing what he was given, and returned the container clean the next day. Their conversations were brief. A greeting, a question about the weather, a nod in passing. Frank never begged, never complained about the cold or his situation. He never asked Hannah why she helped him. That, more than anything, made it easier for her to keep going. Hannah had seen other people on the street. Some shouted at passing cars. Some pleaded. Some were lost in their own noise and pain. Frank was different. He carried himself with a quiet restraint, a dignity that hadn't been worn down by sleeping outdoors or being ignored. One morning, as Hannah handed him a container of oatmeal and a roll, she hesitated. "My mom's sick," she said, almost without thinking. The words slipped out before she could stop them. Frank looked at her, attentive but not intrusive. "She had a stroke," Hannah continued, her voice low. "She can't really be alone. I check on her before work. And after. All the time, really." Frank nodded once. He didn't interrupt. He didn't offer advice. He didn't say he understood. "That's a heavy thing to carry," he said finally. It wasn't sympathy. It wasn't pity. It was acknowledgement. Hannah felt something ease in her chest. Just a fraction. Frank didn't ask questions after that. He didn't pry into her life or her reasons. He listened when she spoke and stayed silent when she didn't. In return, Hannah didn't ask how he had ended up where he was. She didn't need the story. Everyone had one, and most of them hurt. Over the weeks, she noticed things. Frank never drank, never cursed. He kept his small space near the alley clean, arranging his belongings carefully as if order still mattered. His hands were rough and steady, not trembling the way she had seen in others. There was trust there, growing slowly without demands, not the kind that needed promises or words. Just two people acknowledging each other's existence in a world that rarely paused long enough to do that. Hannah continued to bring him food when no one was watching, and Frank continued to receive it with the same quiet respect, as if both of them understood that this small exchange mattered more than either of them was willing to say out loud. Richard Cole liked to arrive unannounced. Some days he showed up before noon, his heavy boots echoing across the cafe floor. Other days it was late afternoon, when the lunch rush had just ended and everyone was already tired. He never called ahead. He didn't need to. The Morning Corner Café belonged to him, and he made sure no one forgot it. Richard was in his early 50s, broad-shouldered, with a permanent flush in his face and a habit of scanning the room as if something were always about to go missing. His eyes moved constantly over the register, the tables, the kitchen doorway, counting, measuring, looking for fault. Hannah felt his presence before he spoke. The tension in the air shifted, conversations quieted, and even the clatter of dishes seemed to grow sharper. "Why is table 3 still dirty?" he demanded one morning, pointing with a thick finger. "Customers see that and think we're sloppy." Hannah had cleared it less than a minute earlier. She didn't argue. She wiped the table again, slower this time, aware of his gaze burning into her back. It was always like this. Nothing was ever good enough. If the coffee was too hot, it was her fault. If it cooled by the time a customer complained, it was her fault again. She learned to apologize quickly, to keep her voice even, to swallow whatever she felt rising in her throat. Some customers made it worse. One man snapped his fingers at her from across the room. Another spoke loudly about incompetent staff, when his order wasn't exactly how he wanted it. Hannah stood there, listening, nodding, replacing dishes, absorbing the words because she didn't have the luxury of reacting. Behind the counter, the old register hummed as she rang up orders, her hands moving automatically. In her pocket, her phone vibrated with a notification she already knew the meaning of. The pharmacy reminder. Another refill needed soon. Another expense she wasn't sure how to cover. Her paycheck was late again. When she asked Richard about it, he waved her off without looking up from his phone. "Next week," he said. "Cash flow's tight. You'll get it." Next week had already come and gone. Hannah did the math in her head as she wiped down the counter. Rent, utilities, medication. There was no room left. No buffer. Everything depended on those missing hours of pay finally turning into dollars. It was around this time that she started noticing things she hadn't before. Richard began coming by late at night, long after the cafe had closed. Hannah only knew because she sometimes returned to grab something she'd forgotten, a scarf, her notebook, and found the lights on in the back. When she asked him once what he was doing there so late, he answered without meeting her eyes. "Inventory," he said. "Mind your business." Then there were the men. They came in through the back door, never the front. Hannah saw them only in passing, tall silhouettes in dark jackets, moving quickly, avoiding the main room. They didn't order food. They didn't speak to the staff. They went straight to the storage area, stayed there for a while, and left the same way they came. When Hannah mentioned it to the cook, she got a shrug in return. "Probably suppliers," the woman said. "Or friends of his. Don't get involved." Hannah took the advice. Getting involved was dangerous when you were already barely holding on. The storage room sat beneath the cafe, down a narrow set of stairs that smelled faintly of damp concrete and old cleaning supplies. One afternoon, while restocking flour, Hannah tripped over a pallet that had been pushed too far into the walkway. She steadied herself and noticed something behind it. Large blue sacks, tightly tied, stacked against the wall. They weren't like the others. No labels, no markings, just thick fabric pulled tight with rope. Curious, she reached out and pressed a hand against one. Whatever was inside shifted slightly, heavy and granular. She frowned, then quickly stepped back. It wasn't her business. The cafe stored all kinds of things, and Richard didn't like questions. Later that day, as she came up from the stairs, she nearly collided with him in the hallway. He looked at her sharply. "What were you doing down there?" he asked. "Getting flour," Hannah replied. He watched her for a moment longer than necessary, then stepped aside without another word. From that day on, his eyes followed her more closely. Hannah felt it, the sense that something wasn't right, that the air around the cafe had grown heavier. But she pushed the feeling aside. There was no time to dwell on unease when survival demanded focus. She had a mother to care for, bills to pay, a job she couldn't afford to lose. Whatever was happening behind closed doors, Hannah told herself it had nothing to do with her. And she kept doing what she had always done. Showing up, keeping her head down, and opening the cafe first every single morning. The cafe closed later than usual that night. A sudden burst of customers had come in just before dusk, and by the time the last table was cleared and the floors were mopped, Hannah Whitaker's legs felt hollow, as if she were walking on borrowed strength. She tied off the trash bag, pulled on her coat, and stepped out through the back door into the narrow alley behind the Morning Corner Cafe. The air was sharp and still. Snow clung to the edges of the dumpsters, crusted over from days of freezing and thawing. Hannah adjusted her scarf and started toward the street when a voice stopped her. "Hannah!" She turned. Frank Donovan stood a few feet away, partially in shadow. He had been there so quietly she hadn't noticed him at first, which was unusual. Normally he made some small sound, a shuffle of boots, the scrape of a crate being moved. Tonight he looked as though he had been waiting. Something in his face made her pause. Frank had always been calm, reserved, but there was a tightness in his expression now, a seriousness she hadn't seen before. His shoulders were squared, his jaw set. He didn't smile. "Is everything okay?" Hannah asked, instinctively lowering her voice. Frank took a step closer, then stopped, as if measuring the space between them. I need you to listen to me," he said, carefully. The way he said it sent a ripple of unease through her. "Tomorrow morning," he continued, "you can't be the one who opens the cafe." Hannah frowned. "What?" "You can't open it first," Frank repeated. "Don't unlock the door. Don't be there at 6. Be late. Let someone else do it." The words didn't make sense. Hannah stared at him, searching his face for some sign of explanation. "Frank, why?" He shook his head once. "I can't explain it right now." "That's not an answer," she said, a nervous edge creeping into her voice. "If I don't open the cafe, Richard's going to lose it. He already thinks I know," Frank said quietly. "I know what it could cost you." His certainty unsettled her more than the warning itself. "Then tell me what's going on," Hannah pressed. "Please." Frank glanced down the alley, then back at her. "I just need you to trust me. For one morning. I'll explain everything after. I promise." Trust him. The words echoed uncomfortably in her mind. Frank was a homeless man she had known for a few months. A man with no address, no proof, no obvious reason to interfere in her life. And yet, something about the way he stood there, steady, resolute, made it hard to dismiss him outright. Hannah thought of Richard Cole's face when she was late, of the thin line between keeping her job and losing it, of her mother at home, dependent on her paycheck, however unreliable it had become. "If I'm late, he might fire me," she said. Frank didn't argue. "I know. And you won't tell me why you're asking this." "Not tonight." Silence stretched between them. Hannah felt the cold seep through her coat, through her hesitation, settling somewhere deep in her chest. She had learned to rely on routine because routine was safe, predictable. Opening the cafe first wasn't just a job requirement. It was the anchor of her entire day. The idea of breaking that pattern felt reckless, and yet something inside her shifted, a quiet, instinctive warning she couldn't quite explain. "You're asking me to risk everything," she said softly. Frank met her gaze. "I wouldn't ask if it didn't matter." Hannah swallowed. Her heart beat faster, the way it did when she stood at the edge of something uncertain. "All right," she said at last, the word leaving her mouth before she could change her mind. I'll be late. Frank's shoulders relaxed, just slightly. Thank you. You said you'd explain, she reminded him. I will, he said. The day after tomorrow. I promise. Without another word, he turned and walked away, disappearing into the darkness beyond the alley. Hannah stood there for a long moment, the echo of his warning lingering in the cold air. As she finally headed home, her keys felt heavier in her pocket than they ever had before. Frank Donovan did not sleep that night. He sat on the edge of his thin mattress in the basement of the abandoned building across the street from the Morning Corner Café, his coat pulled tight around him, listening to the sounds that rose and fell with the city's breathing. Pipes knocked somewhere above him. Wind pushed against loose boards. Snow hissed softly as it slid from ledges and windowsills. At a little after midnight, the sound of an engine cut through the quiet. Frank lifted his head. Headlights washed briefly across the cracked concrete outside the basement window, then disappeared. He moved slowly, careful not to make noise, and leaned closer to the glass. A dark SUV had pulled into the alley behind the cafe. Frank recognized it immediately. Richard Cole's vehicle. He had seen it often enough in daylight. The driver's door opened. Richard stepped out, heavy and purposeful, his breath visible in the cold. Two other men followed. They were younger, broader, dressed in dark jackets that blended into the night. They moved with efficiency, not hesitation. Frank felt something tighten in his chest. The three of them walked straight to the back entrance of the cafe. Richard unlocked the door. No lights came on. They slipped inside and closed it behind them. Frank waited. Years ago, he had learned the difference between curiosity and caution. He stayed where he was for several minutes, counting his breaths, listening. When nothing changed, he pulled on his boots and eased out into the alley, keeping close to the wall. The back door of the cafe was not fully closed. It was left just slightly ajar. Frank positioned himself beside it, pressing his back to the brick, becoming still. Voices drifted out from inside. Tomorrow morning, one of the men said. His voice was low, roughened by cigarettes. It'll go off the moment the door opens. You're sure? The second man asked. Younger, sharper, positive. Triggers set under the threshold. Pressure switch. Clean. Richard spoke, next impatient. And the gas line? Close enough to sell it as an accident, the first man replied. Explosion won't be big. Just enough. Frank closed his eyes briefly. Who's opening in the morning? The younger man asked. That girl, Richard said. The waitress. Always first. 6 on the... Frank's jaw tightened. She saw the sacks, Richard continued. Didn't say anything, but she knows something's off. I watched her come up from storage. We can't leave loose ends. Seems excessive, the younger man muttered. She's just some kid. Kids talk, Richard snapped. And witnesses get curious. This way it's over. One less problem. The men fell silent for a moment. Frank felt the cold bite through his gloves, but he didn't move. You sure nobody else will be there? The first man asked. She's always alone, Richard said. Always. It's her job. Frank's heart pounded, slow and heavy. An image rose in his mind without warning. Hannah's tired smile, the way she handed him food without meeting his eyes, as if trying not to embarrass either of them. The quiet mention of her mother, sick and waiting at home. The men shifted inside. Tools clinked softly against tile. Frank knew the sound. He had heard it before. Years ago, under very different skies. Combat engineer. That was what they had called him. Explosives training. Clearing roads. Disarming devices meant to tear through vehicles and bodies alike. His hands remembered even when his life had fallen apart. The careful placement, the methodical movements, the certainty of intent. They were planting a device. When the men finally emerged nearly an hour later, Frank stepped back into the shadows. Richard locked the door behind them. The SUV pulled away, its taillights vanishing at the end of the alley. Frank waited until the silence returned. Then he moved. He approached the front of the cafe slowly, his breath shallow. He knelt near the entrance, close enough to confirm what he already knew. He didn't touch anything. He didn't need to. The placement was obvious to someone who had spent years learning how these things worked. Under the threshold, set to trigger when the door opened. Hannah would have been standing right there. Frank stood, his hands trembling now, not from cold, but from urgency. There was no time to waste, no one to convince, no proof to gather. He returned to the basement and retrieved the old phone he kept hidden, its battery barely alive. He stepped back into the alley, dialed and waited. When the voice answered, he spoke quickly, clearly, gave the address, said there was an explosive device at the cafe, said it would detonate when the front door opened. He ended the call before questions could be asked. Frank removed the SIM card and crushed it beneath his boot. Then he did something he had learned long ago to do when danger followed. He disappeared. By the time the snow began to fall again, lightly and without warning, Frank Donovan was already moving away from the cafe, carrying the weight of what he had heard and the hope that Hannah would listen to him in the morning. Hannah Whitaker woke before the alarm again. For a few seconds, she lay still, disoriented, her mind reaching automatically for the familiar shape of the morning. Get up, check on her mother, leave by 5:30, open the cafe at 6. The routine was so deeply ingrained that it took effort to remember what Frank had said the night before. Don't be the one who opens the door tomorrow. Her stomach tightened. Hannah sat up slowly. The apartment was quiet except for the low hum of the heater struggling against the cold. She checked on her mother first. As always, her breathing was shallow but steady. Hannah adjusted the blanket, set out the morning medication, and stood there longer than usual watching, as if some instinct told her not to rush. She checked the clock. If she left now, she could still make it on time. Her hand hovered over her coat. Images crowded her thoughts. Richard Cole's narrowed eyes, the unspoken rule of being first, the thin margin between employment and disaster. If she was late, he would notice. He always noticed. He might dock her pay. He might fire her. But then she remembered Frank's face, the seriousness, the certainty, the way he hadn't tried to persuade her with fear or explanation, only with trust. Hannah exhaled slowly and sat back down. She made coffee. She drank it standing in the kitchen, hands wrapped tightly around the mug. She waited until the clock ticked past 6 o'clock, then 6:05. Her heart beat faster with every passing minute. At 6:20, she finally pulled on her coat and stepped outside. The walk to the cafe felt different that morning. The cold seemed sharper, the streets unnaturally quiet. As Hannah turned the corner onto the block where the Morning Corner Cafe stood, she slowed. Something was wrong. Red and blue lights flashed against the snow-covered buildings. Police vehicles lined the street, their engines idling. Yellow tape stretched across the sidewalk. A fire truck was parked near the entrance, its lights still spinning silently. Hannah stopped in her tracks. For a moment, her mind refused to make sense of what she was seeing. She stood there, frozen, as people moved around the cafe with deliberate urgency. Uniformed officers, firefighters, a man in heavy protective gear kneeling near the entrance. Her legs carried her forward without conscious thought until an officer held up a hand. "You can't come through here," he said. I work here," Hannah managed. "What happened?" The officer studied her face, then nodded to another man nearby. "She's staff." A detective stepped closer. "Are you Hannah Whitaker?" "Yes." "We need you to stay right there." Her chest felt tight. "What's going on?" The detective didn't answer immediately. He glanced toward the cafe entrance, where a technician was carefully backing away from the door. There was an explosive device planted under the front threshold, he said finally. It was active. The words landed slowly, each one heavier than the last. Active. Hannah repeated. Yes, the detective said. Pressure triggered. It would have detonated when the door was opened. Hannah's knees weakened. She reached out blindly and gripped the edge of a nearby car. When? She asked. The detective checked his watch. It was disarmed at 5:58, 2 minutes before 6. Hannah stared at him, unable to speak. That door, he continued, his voice steady, professional. Who usually opens it in the morning? Hannah's throat closed. I do. Silence settled between them. If you had been here on time, the detective said gently, you would have been standing directly over it. Hannah's vision blurred. The street tilted, the sounds around her fading into a distant roar. She imagined it, her hand on the key, the familiar motion, the split second before everything ended. There would have been no warning, no time to react. She would have been killed instantly. Fear surged through her, sharp and overwhelming, followed by a rush of relief so powerful it left her shaking. She pressed a hand to her mouth, breathing hard, tears stinging her eyes without warning. I was late, she whispered, more to herself than anyone else. The detective nodded. That delay saved your life. Hannah turned away, her back against the cold metal of the car, and let the truth sink in. Frank's voice echoed in her mind. Don't be the one who opens the door tomorrow. He had known. As the realization settled, one thought cut through the chaos with absolute clarity. Frank Donovan had saved her life, and no one could tell her where he was now. The cafe did not reopen that day. By mid-morning, the Morning Corner Café had become something else entirely, a sealed crime scene. Its familiar windows clouded not by steam from coffee, but by the reflection of police tape and flashing lights. Neighbors gathered at a distance, whispering, watching as officers moved in and out with measured urgency. Hannah Whitaker sat in the back of a patrol car with a blanket wrapped around her shoulders, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. The cold had settled deep into her bones, but it was nothing compared to the hollow ache in her chest. Every few minutes, she replayed the same thought. If she had arrived on time, she would not be sitting here. Inside the cafe, the investigation unfolded quickly. Once the bomb squad confirmed the device had been fully disarmed, detectives moved in. The storage room beneath the cafe became the center of attention. Officers descended the narrow stairs with flashlights and gloves, photographing everything before touching a single object. The blue sacks did not remain mysterious for long. They were cut open one by one, revealing tightly sealed packages stacked inside. Narcotics, a large quantity, far beyond anything meant for personal use. Enough to supply a distribution network, enough to explain the late-night visits and the men who never ordered coffee. The cafe was not just a cafe. It was a drop point. As the scope of the operation became clear, additional units arrived. What had begun as an attempted bombing expanded into a full narcotics investigation. Phones were seized. Records were pulled. Surveillance footage from nearby buildings was collected. Richard Cole was arrested before noon. Hannah did not see it happen, but she heard about it from an officer who spoke quietly, as if afraid the words themselves might upset the fragile balance holding her together. Richard had been taken into custody at his home. Drug trafficking, conspiracy, attempted murder. The phrase echoed in her mind, heavy and unreal. Later that afternoon, Hannah was escorted to the station to give her statement. The room was small and neutral, the walls bare except for a clock that ticked far too loudly. A detective sat across from her, his notebook open, his tone calm and precise. Hannah told them everything. She spoke about her schedule, about always opening the cafe first. She described Richard's behavior, the delayed wages, the men entering through the back door. She mentioned the blue sacks and how she had dismissed them, not realizing what they contained. When they asked about Frank Donovan, her voice faltered. She explained how she had been bringing him food, how he had warned her not to open the cafe that morning, how he had refused to explain, only asking her to trust him. The detective listened carefully, asking clarifying questions, writing everything down. "Without that warning," he said finally, "you would have been killed." Hannah nodded, her hands trembling slightly. She had known it already, but hearing it stated so plainly made the truth settle deeper. By the end of the interview, it was clear that Hannah was no longer just an employee who had narrowly escaped harm. She was a key witness. Her testimony established motive, pattern, and opportunity. It tied Richard Cole directly to the attempt on her life. Before she left, a victim advocate met with her. The woman spoke gently, explaining next steps, offering resources. Hannah barely heard most of it until one sentence cut through the fog. "You're eligible for victim compensation," the advocate said. "Medical expenses, lost wages, counseling. We'll help you apply." Hannah stared at her. "You mean, for my mom's care too?" The advocate nodded. "Yes, that falls under it." Relief washed over Hannah, so suddenly it left her dizzy. For the first time in months, there was a path forward that didn't rely solely on her endurance. But one absence overshadowed everything else. Frank Donovan was nowhere to be found. Hannah asked every officer she encountered. She described him in detail: the coat, the beard, the quiet way he spoke. Some nodded, some took notes, but none could tell her where he was. He made an anonymous call. One detective confirmed, "We're trying to trace it, but whoever he is, he knew how to disappear." The word stung more than she expected. As evening fell and Hannah was finally allowed to go home, the street in front of the cafe remained cordoned off. The lights dimmed, the crowd thinned, but the weight of what had been uncovered lingered in the cold air. The Morning Corner Cafe had been built on fear and greed, and it had nearly cost Hannah her life. Now, justice had begun to take shape, clear, methodical, unavoidable. But the man who had set everything in motion, who had saved her without hesitation, was still missing. And Hannah knew she would not rest until she found him. Hannah Whitaker did not return to work. The cafe was closed indefinitely, sealed behind tape and police orders. But even if it had reopened, she knew she would not have gone back right away. Her thoughts were fixed on one thing: finding Frank Donovan. She began where she knew him best, behind the cafe, in the narrow alley where he had waited so patiently, day after day. The space was empty now. The crate he used to sit on was gone. The small arrangement of belongings he kept tucked neatly against the wall had vanished, as if he had never been there at all. Hannah widened her search. She walked the surrounding blocks, stopping by doorways and underpasses, asking quietly if anyone had seen an older man in an army coat. Some people shook their heads. Others looked away. A few offered vague directions. Someone like that passed through, maybe, but no one stayed long in winter. By the third day, discouragement began to settle in. Frank had disappeared deliberately. She knew that much. He had done what he came to do and then stepped out of sight, just as he had said. On the fourth evening, she found him. He was sitting in a small city park several blocks away, near a line of bare trees that rattled softly in the wind. He looked thinner than she remembered, his shoulders more hunched, but there was no mistaking him. Hannah stopped a few feet away. "Frank." He looked up slowly, his expression guarded. For a moment, she thought he might stand and leave. Instead, he stayed where he was. "You shouldn't be looking for me," he said. "You saved my life," Hannah replied. "I wasn't going to stop." They sat on opposite ends of the bench, the cold seeping through their coats. For a while, neither spoke. Finally, Frank exhaled. "I knew this day would come," he said quietly. He told her the truth then, without embellishment. He had served as a combat engineer years earlier. trained to handle explosives in places where mistakes were fatal. When he returned home, nothing fit anymore. His marriage collapsed under the weight of what he couldn't say. His son stopped calling. Drinking filled the silence for a while until it didn't. "I didn't end up on the street overnight," he said. "It happened one bad decision at a time." Hannah listened, her hands folded tightly in her lap. "When I saw those men," Frank continued, "I recognized the signs immediately. The way they moved, the way they talked about it. I couldn't pretend I didn't know." "You could have walked away," Hannah said. Frank shook his head. "I've walked away before. It costs too much." She told him what the police had found, about Richard Cole's arrest, about the charges. Frank closed his eyes briefly, absorbing the information. When he opened them again, there was fear there, unmistakable and human. "I can't deal with the authorities," he said. "I don't trust systems anymore." Hannah took a breath. "They already know someone called it in. They're trying to find you." Frank's jaw tightened. "Then I'll keep moving." "No," Hannah said firmly. "You don't have to." She told him what she intended to do before he could object. She went back to the police the next morning and asked to speak to the detective handling the case. She told them everything Frank had shared with her, his warning, his military training, the reason he had recognized the danger so quickly. "This man prevented a murder," she said. "Mine." The investigation moved faster after that. Within days, law enforcement confirmed Frank Donovan's service record, his training, his honorable discharge. The pieces fit too neatly to ignore. When officers approached Frank again, it wasn't with handcuffs. They offered him options: veteran rehabilitation, transitional housing, counseling, support services he had never believed were meant for someone like him. Frank was wary, suspicious, but Hannah stood with him through the meetings, through the explanations, through the paperwork that felt heavier than it should have. "You don't owe anyone anything," she told him, "but you don't have to do this alone anymore." The day Frank agreed to enter a veterans rehabilitation program, the sky was overcast, the air heavy with snow. He shook Hannah's hand once, then pulled her into a brief, awkward embrace. "I didn't save you to be thanked," he said. "I did it because it was right." "I know," Hannah replied. "That's why it matters." As Frank walked toward the waiting vehicle, Hannah felt something settle inside her, a sense that, for the first time since the explosion that never happened, things were moving toward repair. Not erasure, not forgetting, but something closer to redemption. The compensation check arrived on a quiet Tuesday morning, delivered in a plain envelope that looked far too ordinary for what it represented. Hannah Whitaker sat at the kitchen table for a long time before opening it, her mother resting in the next room, the soft rhythm of the television filling the apartment. The amount was enough to change things, not dramatically, not overnight, but enough to breathe. The first thing Hannah did was stabilize her mother's care. She met with a home health coordinator, arranged consistent physical therapy, and secured medications months in advance. The anxiety that had lived permanently in her chest began, slowly, to loosen its grip. For the first time since the stroke, she could plan beyond the next prescription refill. Her mother noticed the difference immediately. "You're standing straighter," she said one afternoon, her words slow but clear, like you're not waiting for something bad to happen. Hannah smiled. She hadn't realized it herself, but it was true. Frank entered the Veterans Rehabilitation Program 2 weeks later. The facility was modest, clean, structured, quiet. He struggled at first with routine, with rules, with the idea that help came without strings attached. But he stayed. Hannah visited when she could, bringing coffee and sitting with him during the long afternoons when progress felt invisible. "You don't rush recovery," Frank told her once. "You just show up every day and don't quit." She carried that sentence with her. The idea for the cafe had existed in Hannah's mind long before the explosion that never happened. It had been a quiet dream, buried beneath exhaustion and fear. Now, With the cafe where she had worked sealed and disgraced, the dream resurfaced. Not as fantasy, but as necessity. She didn't want luxury. She wanted honesty. She found a small corner space for rent in a working-class neighborhood on the south side of Des Moines. The storefront was narrow, the floors worn. The windows clouded with years of neglect. But the bones were solid, and the rent was manageable. She signed the lease with hands that trembled only slightly. She called it Open Hands Café. Frank helped when his program allowed day passes. He fixed loose wiring, reinforced the back door, checked sightlines and locks with the precision of someone who understood how danger moved through spaces. He never told her what to do, only what to consider. "You don't build places assuming the worst," he said. "You just make sure the worst can't surprise you." Hannah painted the walls herself, choosing warm, neutral colors. She bought second-hand tables and sanded them smooth. The menu was simple. Soup, bread, breakfast plates, coffee strong enough to wake the dead. No pretense, no pressure. During the early weeks, business was slow. She learned to measure success differently, not in crowds, but in returning faces. A bus driver who came every morning for oatmeal. A retired couple who split a sandwich and stayed for an hour. A young mother who brought her child after therapy appointments. One afternoon, a man introduced himself as Daniel Brooks. He was a local produce supplier, recently started on his own after leaving a larger distribution company. He brought a crate of apples and leafy greens, offered fair prices, no contracts, no pressure. "I prefer places where I can see who I'm working with," he said. Hannah appreciated that. Daniel became a regular presence, not intrusively, not romantically at first. He dropped off produce twice a week, sometimes stayed for coffee. Conversation grew naturally, grounded in shared work and mutual respect. There were no dramatic confessions, no sweeping gestures, just steadiness. The cafe found its rhythm. Hannah hired one part-time employee. Frank began coming by weekly, offering security advice, eventually taking on a small paid role checking systems and training staff on emergency awareness. The work mattered to him. It gave shape to his days. "I like knowing something depends on me," he admitted. So did Hannah. One evening, as the cafe closed and the lights dimmed, Hannah stood behind the counter and looked around. Nothing in the room was extravagant. Everything in it was earned. No one shouted at her here. No one withheld wages. No one threatened her life for convenience. This place could not be taken away easily. At the end of the week, Hannah placed a small sign near the register. It wasn't promotional. It wasn't clever. It read, "Kindness changes more than we can see." Customers noticed. Some asked about it. Hannah never explained fully. She didn't need to. The cafe didn't make her rich. It didn't erase the past, but it gave her something the old place never had. Dignity replaced fear. Choice replaced survival. And for the first time, Hannah understood that rebuilding wasn't about forgetting what had almost been taken from her. It was about creating something that could stand quietly and firmly, no matter what came next. Before we move into the final chapter, what do you believe truly gives a person security? Money, people, or purpose? Share your thoughts in the comments. Hannah Whitaker and Daniel Brooks did not plan a wedding that would impress anyone. There was no ballroom, no elaborate decorations, no carefully staged photographs. They married on a quiet Saturday afternoon inside Open Hands Café, after closing hours, with the chairs pushed aside and the tables arranged in a loose circle. Sunlight filtered through the front windows, catching on the glass coffee jars and the clean white walls Hannah had painted herself. The people who filled the room were not guests in the traditional sense. They were neighbors, regulars, the bus driver who came every morning, the retired couple who always split one sandwich, the young mother whose child waved from the corner booth every time she visited. This was the community that had grown. Quietly and honestly around Hannah, Daniel stood beside her, steady and calm, wearing a simple suit that fit him well. He took Hannah's hands without ceremony, without hesitation, as though this moment was simply the next right step. Nothing rushed, nothing forced. When Hannah looked around the room, she felt no nervousness, only recognition. This was where she belonged. Frank Donovan sat in the front row. He wore his restored veteran uniform, pressed and formal, the medals arranged neatly on his chest. The transformation was striking, not because it erased who he had been, but because it revealed who he still was. His posture was straighter now, his eyes clearer. The weight he had carried for years no longer bent him forward. When it was time for him to speak, Frank rose slowly. The room quieted. "I'm not good with speeches," he said, his voice steady but unpolished. "So I'll keep this simple." He looked at Hannah, then Daniel, then the room filled with familiar faces. "There was a time when I thought kindness was a weakness," Frank continued. "I thought it got people hurt. I thought the world only respected force." He paused, swallowing hard. "I was wrong." He told them, briefly, without drama, how he had reached the lowest point of his life, how invisibility had almost convinced him that he no longer mattered, and how one young woman, exhausted and struggling herself, had quietly handed him food without being asked, without being watched. "She treated me like a human being," Frank said. "Not a problem, not a burden." His voice tightened. "When danger came, I didn't save her because I'm a hero. I saved her because she reminded me who I was supposed to be." Silence settled over the room, heavy and reverent. "Kindness saved both our lives," Frank said at last. Hannah felt tears rise, unashamed. Daniel squeezed her hand. After the ceremony, there was food, simple, warm, homemade. People lingered. Laughter filled the cafe in a way Hannah had never imagined during its early days. Her mother sat near the counter, smiling quietly, her hands folded around a cup of tea, watching her daughter with a pride that needed no words. The cafe continued after the wedding, unchanged in name but deeper in meaning. It remained a place where no one was rushed out for ordering too little, where conversations were allowed to take time, where second chances were not advertised but practiced. Frank took on a permanent role overseeing safety and operations. He was dependable, meticulous, quietly proud of his work. Daniel expanded his produce routes, keeping his partnership with the cafe fair and personal. Hannah continued to open the doors every morning, this time by choice, not obligation. And every day, someone new walked in carrying something unseen. Fear, loneliness, fatigue, loss. Open Hands Cafe did not fix those things, but it interrupted them. Years later, Hannah would sometimes think back to the morning she had almost died, to the door she did not open, to the warning she chose to trust. She understood now that evil often counts on routine, on silence, on people believing they are too small to matter. Kindness breaks that pattern, not loudly, not heroically, but decisively. Hannah placed a new sign on the cafe wall one evening, next to the old one. Smaller, simpler. "You never know whose life you're touching." And it was true.